Captain Jessica Martinez had been flying for 12 years, but she'd never encountered anything like this. The morning started routinely enough at Edwards Air Force Base, where she worked as a test pilot for experimental aircraft. The XR-7 prototype she was assigned to test had been in development for 3 years, a revolutionary reconnaissance drone that could operate autonomously or with human override. Jessica had logged over 200 hours on various prototypes, earning her the respect of her colleagues and the trust of her superiors. The briefing that morning was conducted by Colonel Davidson, a stern man with silver hair and cold blue eyes who'd never quite warmed to having women in his squadron. He outlined the mission parameters: a routine test flight over the Nevada desert, checking the XR-7 stealth capabilities and navigation systems. Jessica listened attentively, taking notes on her tablet as Davidson droned on about altitude restrictions and communication protocols. What he didn't mention was the classified payload the aircraft was carrying, something Jessica would discover much later. As Jessica performed her pre-flight checks, she noticed Lieutenant Brad Thompson hovering nearby. Thompson was Davidson's golden boy, a pilot who'd been fast-tracked through the ranks despite having less experience than Jessica. He'd been vocal about his belief that certain aircraft were too advanced for female pilots, comments that had earned him a formal reprimand but no real consequences. Today, he seemed particularly interested in her mission, asking pointed questions about her flight plan and repeatedly checking his watch. The XR-7 handled beautifully during takeoff, its experimental engines purring with quiet efficiency. Jessica guided the aircraft through its initial maneuvers, testing its responsiveness and documenting every detail. The Nevada landscape spread beneath her like a vast canvas of browns and grays, punctuated by the occasional mountain range. She was climbing to her assigned altitude when her radio crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. Unidentified aircraft, this is Viper Squadron. You are entering restricted airspace. Alter course immediately or you will be intercepted. The voice was sharp, professional, and completely confusing. Jessica checked her navigation system 3 times. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, following the flight plan that had been approved by her own base. She responded immediately, identifying herself and her mission, but the response was even more alarming. Negative, Captain Martinez. Our records show no authorized flights in this sector. You have 30 seconds to comply with course correction or we will consider you hostile. Jessica's blood ran cold. She could see them now, 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons approaching from her 9 o'clock position, their sleek forms cutting through the desert air like hunting hawks. These weren't training aircraft. They were fully armed interceptors, and they were treating her like an enemy. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. She attempted to contact Edwards Air Force Base, but her communications were being jammed. The F-16s had positioned themselves on either side of her aircraft, their pilots visible through their canopies. Jessica could see the tension in their postures, hands poised over weapon systems. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and this routine test flight could become a deadly confrontation. The lead F-16 pilot's voice came through on the emergency frequency, cutting through the static. Unknown aircraft, you are ordered to land immediately at coordinates we will provide. Any deviation from our instructions will be met with force. Jessica's training kicked in, her voice steady despite her racing heart as she acknowledged the order. She had no choice but to comply, but every instinct told her something was terribly wrong. The forced landing site was a remote airstrip Jessica had never seen before, surrounded by unmarked vehicles and personnel in desert camouflage. As she taxied to a stop, she could see armed guards taking positions around her aircraft. The F-16s remained airborne, circling like vultures as she shut down the XR-7 systems. Her hands shook slightly as she removed her helmet, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. Colonel Richard Hayes was waiting for her as she climbed down from the cockpit. Unlike Davidson, Hayes was a man she'd never met, his uniform bearing no unit insignia she recognized. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, and his expression was unreadable as he approached. Behind him stood a team of technicians who were already moving toward her aircraft with equipment she didn't recognize. "Captain Martinez," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You're going to answer some questions about your flight plan and the modifications made to your aircraft." Jessica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. She'd been flying the XR-7 for months, but she'd never authorized any modifications, nor had she been informed of any. "Sir, I'm not sure what you're referring to," Jessica replied, maintaining military bearing despite her growing unease. "I was conducting a routine test flight under direct orders from Colonel Davidson at Edwards. My aircraft is equipped with standard experimental systems, nothing more." Hayes removed his sunglasses, revealing dark eyes that seemed to look right through her. "Captain, we have intelligence suggesting your aircraft was being used to transport sensitive materials without proper authorization," Hayes continued. "Materials that could pose a significant security threat if they fell into the wrong hands." Jessica's mind reeled. She'd been flying what she thought were routine test missions, but now it appeared she'd been unknowingly involved in something far more serious. The technicians were swarming over her aircraft now, their equipment beeping and clicking as they conducted what appeared to be a thorough scan. Jessica watched helplessly as they examined every panel, every access hatch, looking for something she didn't understand. One technician called out to Hayes, his voice urgent but too quiet for Jessica to hear the words. "Captain, you're going to remain here while we conduct our investigation," Hayes informed her, gesturing to a nearby prefab building. This is for your own safety as much as ours. Until we determine the full scope of this situation, you're considered a potential security risk. Jessica's stomach dropped. She was being detained, treated like a criminal, and she didn't even know what crime she was supposed to have committed. The holding facility was sparse but clean, containing only a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a narrow window that looked out onto the desert. Jessica was left alone with her thoughts, trying to piece together what could have gone wrong. She replayed every detail of her recent flights, every conversation with Davidson, every interaction with the ground crew. Nothing made sense. Hours passed before Hayes returned, this time accompanied by a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Chen from an unnamed government agency. Chen was all business, her dark hair pulled back severely, and her expression giving nothing away. She placed a tablet on the desk between them and powered it on, revealing photographs that made Jessica's blood run cold. "Captain Martinez," Chen began, her voice clinical and precise, "we need to discuss the burn patterns on your aircraft's nose cone. These patterns are consistent with exposure to highly classified experimental materials, materials that were reported missing from a secure facility 3 days ago." Jessica stared at the photographs, seeing for the first time the subtle discoloration on her aircraft that she'd never noticed before. The photographs showed Jessica's XR-7 from angles she'd never seen, taken by surveillance equipment she hadn't known existed. The burn patterns Agent Chen referenced were subtle but unmistakable once pointed out, a series of discolorations along the nose cone that formed an almost artistic pattern. Jessica had flown the aircraft dozens of times without noticing them, but now they seemed to glow with sinister significance. "I've never seen these marks before," Jessica said honestly, studying the images with growing dread. "If my aircraft has been exposed to classified materials, it wasn't with my knowledge or consent." Agent Chen's expression remained neutral, but Jessica caught a flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, or calculation. "Captain, these materials are highly radioactive and extremely dangerous," Chen continued, pulling up additional images on her tablet. "The facility they were stolen from has been sealed off, and 3 security personnel are in critical condition from exposure. If you've been unknowingly transporting these materials, you may have been exposed to lethal levels of radiation." Jessica's hand instinctively went to her throat, where she'd been experiencing a slight soreness for the past few days. She'd attributed it to dry air and long flights, but now she wondered if it was something far more serious. The room seemed to spin slightly as the implications hit her. She might be dying, and she didn't even know how it had happened. "We need to know everything about your recent flights," Hayes interjected, leaning forward in his chair. "Every conversation with your commanding officer, every interaction with ground crew, every deviation from standard procedure. Someone used you as an unwitting courier, and we need to find out who. Jessica's mind raced back through the past weeks, searching for any detail that might explain this nightmare. She remembered Thompson's unusual interest in her flights, his pointed questions about her routes and timing. She recalled Davidson's increasing irritability during briefings, his tendency to dismiss her questions about mission parameters. Most disturbing of all, she remembered the new ground crew member who'd been assigned to her aircraft, a quiet man named Rodriguez who'd seemed nervous and avoided eye contact. "There was someone new on my ground crew," Jessica said slowly, the pieces beginning to form a picture she didn't want to see. "Martinez Rodriguez. He started about 2 weeks ago, said he was transferred from another base. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, very thorough with his work." Chen and Hayes exchanged glances, and Jessica saw Chen make a note on her tablet. "What did Rodriguez look like?" Hayes asked, his voice taking on a new urgency. Jessica described the man as best she could remember: medium height, dark hair, a distinctive scar along his left jawline. She mentioned his nervous habits, the way he'd watch her during pre-flight checks, and how he'd always volunteered to handle the more technical aspects of aircraft maintenance. Chen pulled up a series of photographs on her tablet, surveillance images of various personnel at Edwards Air Force Base. Jessica scrolled through them until she found Rodriguez, pointing him out immediately. "That's him. He said he was former Navy, transferred to Air Force support. Very knowledgeable about aircraft systems, maybe too knowledgeable." "Captain Martinez," Chen said quietly. "The man you've identified as Rodriguez is actually Viktor Petrov, a former Soviet engineer who's been selling classified technology to foreign governments. He's been missing for 6 months, and we believe he's been operating under multiple identities at various military installations." Jessica felt the world tilt around her. She'd been working with a spy, someone who'd been using her aircraft to transport stolen materials. The realization that she'd been manipulated, used as an unwitting pawn in an espionage operation, filled Jessica with a mixture of rage and fear. She'd trusted Rodriguez, had even begun to think of him as a friend. He'd been patient with her questions, helpful with technical problems, and all the while he'd been turning her into a criminal. "We need your help to catch him," Hayes said, his tone shifting from accusatory to conspiratorial. "He's still at Edwards, still using your aircraft for his operations. If you're willing to cooperate, we can set up a controlled operation to gather evidence and apprehend him." Jessica didn't hesitate. She'd been betrayed, her career destroyed, her life potentially forfeit, all because of one man's greed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but Jessica knew it would be the most dangerous mission of her career. She would return to Edwards Air Force Base as if nothing had happened, maintaining her normal routine while wearing a wire and gathering evidence of Rodriguez's activities. The cover story was that she'd been temporarily grounded for routine medical tests, a common enough occurrence that wouldn't raise suspicions. Agent Chen had spent hours briefing Jessica on what to look for, how to document Rodriguez's activities without arousing suspicion. The tiny recording device hidden in her flight helmet was nearly invisible, its battery capable of recording for up to 12 hours. Jessica practiced natural conversation techniques, learning to steer discussions toward topics that might incriminate Rodriguez without seeming obvious. Colonel Davidson's reaction to her return was exactly what they'd expected, irritation masked as concern. He grumbled about the disruption to his flight schedule, complained about the medical department's inefficiency, and made several disparaging comments about female pilots and their supposed fragility. Jessica bit her tongue, knowing that her real enemy was elsewhere. Rodriguez was in the hangar when she arrived, working on her aircraft with his usual methodical precision. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into what she now recognized as a calculated smile. "Captain Martinez, good to see you back. I was worried when they said you'd been grounded for tests. Everything okay?" "Just routine stuff," Jessica replied, forcing warmth into her voice. "You know how the medical department is. They find something minor and make it into a federal case." Rodriguez nodded sympathetically, but Jessica noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he worked. The stress of his double life was beginning to show. Over the next several days, Jessica documented everything. She recorded Rodriguez's conversations with unknown contacts on his personal phone, noting the times and apparent content of these exchanges. She observed his unusual interest in specific parts of her aircraft, particularly the cargo bay that she'd never had reason to use. Most importantly, she began to understand the scope of his operation. Rodriguez had been using her aircraft to transport small quantities of classified materials during her routine test flights. The materials were hidden in specially modified compartments that would be nearly impossible to detect during normal inspections. Each flight carried just enough to avoid detection, but over months, the cumulative theft had been enormous. The breakthrough came when Jessica caught Rodriguez installing a new compartment in her aircraft's nose cone. She pretended to be doing routine maintenance checks while actually recording his work. The compartment was lined with lead shielding and contained sophisticated cooling systems, clearly designed to transport radioactive materials safely. "That's new equipment," Jessica commented casually, knowing her wire was recording everything. Rodriguez looked up nervously, his hands stilling on his tools. "Yes, it's an upgrade to the navigation systems. Should improve accuracy by about 15%. It was a lie, and they both knew it. "Mind if I take a look?" Jessica asked, moving closer to the installation. Rodriguez's nervousness increased visibly, and he stepped between her and the compartment. "Actually, Captain, this is classified stuff. I'm not supposed to let anyone else see it until it's fully installed and tested." Another lie, but this one was caught on tape. That evening, Jessica met with Agent Chen at a safe house off base. The evidence they'd gathered was overwhelming. Hours of recorded conversations, photographs of the hidden compartments, documentation of Rodriguez's contact with foreign agents. But Chen had disturbing news about the investigation's scope. "We've discovered that Rodriguez wasn't working alone," Chen revealed, her expression grim. "There's someone else at Edwards, someone with higher clearance who's been providing him with information about classified projects and security protocols. We need to identify this person before we move against Rodriguez." Jessica felt a chill of recognition. The pieces were falling into place in a pattern she didn't want to acknowledge. Davidson's hostility toward her, Thompson's unusual interest in her flights, the convenient timing of certain maintenance schedules. It all pointed to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of her command structure. The next morning brought a new development that changed everything. Jessica arrived at the hangar to find Rodriguez in animated conversation with Lieutenant Thompson, their voices low, but their body language clearly indicating an argument. Jessica positioned herself behind a maintenance cart where she could observe without being seen, her recording equipment capturing every word. "You said this would be the last one," Thompson was saying, his voice tight with stress. "My father's campaign can't afford any more risks. If this gets out, it'll destroy everything he's worked for." Jessica's blood ran cold. Thompson's father was Senator Marcus Thompson, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and a likely presidential candidate. Rodriguez's response was even more chilling. "Your father took the money, Lieutenant. $50 million to ensure certain defense contracts went to our clients. A few missing materials are a small price to pay for that kind of political influence." Jessica realized she wasn't just witnessing espionage. She was uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "The heat's getting too intense," Thompson continued, running his hands through his hair. "That Martinez woman is asking too many questions and Hayes is sniffing around. We need to shut this down before it explodes." Jessica's heart pounded as she realized they were talking about her. Her investigation had been noticed, and now she was in genuine danger. Rodriguez's next words confirmed her worst fears. "Martinez is a problem that needs to be eliminated. I can arrange for a mechanical failure during her next flight, make it look like an accident. One less nosy pilot, and we buy ourselves time to clean up the operation." Jessica's hands shook as she processed the casual way they were discussing her murder. She had heard enough. Jessica quietly backed away from her hiding spot and made her way to the communications room, where she could contact Agent Chen without being overheard. But as she reached for the secure phone, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Colonel Davidson standing behind her, his expression unreadable. "Going somewhere, Captain?" Davidson asked, his voice carrying an undertone she'd never heard before. "I thought you were scheduled for maintenance checks this morning." Jessica's mind raced, trying to determine if Davidson was part of the conspiracy or simply conducting routine business. "Just needed to check on some paperwork, sir," Jessica replied, keeping her voice steady. "Agent Chen requested some additional documentation about my recent flights." Davidson's eyes narrowed at the mention of Chen's name, and Jessica knew she'd made a mistake. "Agent Chen, you said." Davidson moved closer, and Jessica could see calculation in his eyes. "I wasn't aware you were still in contact with the investigation team. I thought that matter had been resolved." Jessica realized that Davidson knew far more about her situation than he'd let on, and his interest was definitely not benign. "It's just routine follow-up, sir," Jessica said, edging toward the door. "Nothing significant." But Davidson stepped to block her path, his hand moving to rest on the weapon at his side. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a threat wrapped in military courtesy. "I think you should come with me, Captain," Davidson said, his voice taking on a commanding tone. "There are some things we need to discuss in private." Jessica knew she was in immediate danger, but she also knew that running would only confirm their suspicions. She had to play along while looking for an opportunity to escape. Davidson led her to his office, closing the door behind them and activating a white noise generator that would prevent electronic surveillance. "Captain Martinez," he began, settling behind his desk, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Your life may depend on it." Jessica's training took over, her expression becoming neutral despite her racing heart. "Of course, sir. I'll answer any questions you have." Davidson studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "How much do you know about Operation Nightfall?" The name meant nothing to Jessica, but Davidson's intensity told her it was significant. She decided to play dumb, hopping to learn more while buying time to plan her escape. "I'm not familiar with that operation, sir. Is it related to my test flights?" Davidson's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Captain, you've been the primary pilot for Operation Nightfall for 6 months. Every flight you've taken, every route you've flown, every piece of equipment you've tested, it's all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan to transfer classified technology to foreign buyers." Jessica felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. She hadn't just been an unwitting courier. She'd been the centerpiece of a massive espionage operation that had compromised national security. "Sir, I had no knowledge of any such operation. I was simply following orders for routine test flights." "And that's exactly what made you perfect for the job," Davidson continued. "An honest pilot with an exemplary record, someone who would never be suspected of treachery. You were the ideal cover for our activities." Jessica noticed his use of the word "our" and realized that Davidson was admitting to being part of the conspiracy. "Why are you telling me this?" Jessica asked, genuinely curious despite her fear. Davidson's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she saw something that might have been regret. "Because, Captain, you're about to have an accident. Rodriguez is preparing your aircraft for what will appear to be a catastrophic system failure. I wanted you to understand why you have to die." The casual way he spoke about her impending murder was almost more frightening than the fact itself. Jessica forced herself to remain calm, to think tactically rather than emotionally. "How long do I have?" she asked, surprising Davidson with her directness. "Your flight is scheduled for 1400 hours," Davidson replied, checking his watch. "That gives us about 2 hours to tie up loose ends. Agent Chen and her team will be told that you suffered a psychological breakdown and stole classified materials before fleeing the country. By the time they sort out the truth, our operation will be concluded and the evidence destroyed." Jessica's mind raced through her options. She was trapped in Davidson's office with an armed superior officer who had just admitted to treason. Her only weapons were her intelligence and her training, but she was running out of time. She needed to find a way to contact Agent Chen or at least document what she'd learned. "Colonel," she said carefully, "I understand why you're doing this, but killing me won't solve your problems. Too many people are already suspicious. Agent Chen has been monitoring my activities, and my sudden death will only intensify their investigation." Davidson's expression darkened at her words. "Agent Chen is about to have her own problems," Davidson replied coldly. "Her investigation has been compromised from the beginning. We've been feeding her false information, leading her away from the real operation. Your death will be the final misdirection, sending her chasing ghosts while we complete our mission." Jessica realized that the conspiracy was even more extensive than she'd imagined. If Davidson was telling the truth, then Agent Chen's entire investigation had been orchestrated by the very people she was trying to catch. The recording device in Jessica's helmet was useless if Chen couldn't be trusted, and every contact she'd made might have been compromised. "There's something else you should know," Davidson continued, almost conversationally. "Your friend Rodriguez isn't just a spy, he's also a killer. The 3 security personnel from the materials facility didn't die from radiation exposure. They were murdered to cover up the theft, and Rodriguez was the one who killed them. The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. She'd been working alongside a murderer, had actually begun to trust him, and now he was planning to kill her as well. The scope of the betrayal was overwhelming, but it also crystallized her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was fighting for justice for the people who had already died. "I need to use the restroom," Jessica said, standing slowly. Davidson's hand moved to his weapon and she could see his finger resting on the safety. "I'll escort you," he said, rising from his chair. "And Captain, don't do anything stupid. I'd prefer not to have to shoot you before your scheduled accident." The walk to the restroom felt like a death march, with Davidson following close behind. Jessica's mind worked frantically, trying to find some way to escape or at least get word to someone who could help. The base was full of personnel, but she didn't know who could be trusted. The conspiracy seemed to reach into every level of command. In the restroom, Jessica splashed cold water on her face, trying to clear her thoughts. She had perhaps 90 minutes before her scheduled flight, 90 minutes to find a way to survive and expose the conspiracy. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing a woman who had been betrayed by everyone she trusted, and made a decision that would change everything. When she emerged from the restroom, Davidson was waiting with two military police officers she didn't recognize. "Captain Martinez," one of them said, "you're under arrest for theft of classified materials and conspiracy to commit treason." Jessica's heart sank as she realized this was part of the setup, a way to ensure she would be on that aircraft when it suffered its accident. "I want to speak with Agent Chen," Jessica said, knowing it was futile but needing to try. Davidson shook his head, his expression almost pitying. "Agent Chen is no longer available. She's been recalled to Washington for reassignment. You're our responsibility now." Jessica allowed herself to be handcuffed, but her mind was still working, still looking for opportunities. They marched her back to the hangar where Rodriguez was putting the finishing touches on her aircraft. He looked up as they approached, his face showing fake concern. "Is everything all right, Captain? You look upset." Jessica wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what she thought of his betrayal, but she forced herself to remain silent. "The captain is having some difficulties," Davidson explained to Rodriguez. "She'll be taking a therapeutic flight to clear her head. Make sure everything is ready for departure." Rodriguez nodded, but Jessica caught a meaningful look that passed between him and Davidson. They were communicating without words, confirming that the sabotage was in place. As they prepared her for what was supposed to be her final flight, Jessica noticed something that gave her hope. One of the F-16 pilots from her forced landing was standing near the control tower, apparently conducting a routine inspection. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw recognition in his gaze. He knew who she was, and more importantly, he knew something was wrong. The pilot was Captain Michael Torres, a decorated combat veteran who had flown escort missions during her forced landing. During the brief time they'd been in contact, Jessica had gotten the impression that he was a man of integrity, someone who took his oath seriously. If anyone on the base could be trusted, it might be him. Jessica made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. As Rodriguez helped her into the cockpit, she managed to catch Tor's attention and mouth a single word: help. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance she had. Tor's expression changed immediately, and she saw him begin moving toward the communications building. "Everything looks good, Captain," Rodriguez said, his voice sickly sweet. "This should be a nice, relaxing flight. Just follow your normal route and everything will be fine." Jessica wanted to grab him by the throat to make him pay for what he'd done, but she forced herself to nod and smile. As the aircraft systems came online, Jessica began her pre-flight checks with unusual thoroughness. She was looking for the sabotage, trying to determine exactly how Rodriguez planned to kill her. The aircraft seemed normal, all systems functioning within parameters, but she knew the death trap was hidden somewhere in the complex machinery. The radio crackled to life with clearance for takeoff, but Jessica noticed something odd about the voice giving the clearance. It wasn't the usual controller, and the pronunciation was slightly off, as if English wasn't the speaker's first language. She realized that even the control tower might be compromised, that the entire base was under the control of the conspiracy. As Jessica taxied toward the runway, she saw Torres running toward one of the F-16s, his ground crew scrambling to prepare the aircraft for immediate launch. She didn't know if he believed her silent plea for help, but it was the only hope she had. In a few minutes, she would be airborne in a sabotaged aircraft, and her fate would be decided by the actions of people she barely knew. The XR-7 lifted off smoothly, its experimental engines providing the familiar sensation of controlled power that Jessica had come to love. For a moment, she almost forgot about the sabotage, lost in the pure joy of flight. But reality crashed back as she remembered that somewhere in the aircraft systems, a deadly trap was waiting to spring. Jessica climbed to her assigned altitude, following the flight plan exactly as she'd been instructed. She had to appear normal, had to give Rodriguez and Davidson no reason to suspect that she knew about their plans. At the same time, she was systematically checking every system, looking for any sign of the sabotage that would soon try to kill her. The radio remained silent, which was unusual for a test flight. Normally, she would be in constant contact with ground control, reporting on aircraft performance and system status. The silence suggested that whatever was about to happen, they didn't want any record of her final moments. Jessica keyed her microphone, trying to establish contact with the base, but received only static in response. 15 minutes into the flight, Jessica found what she was looking for. The fuel flow indicator showed a slight irregularity, too small to trigger an alarm but significant enough to catch her attention. As she watched, the irregularity became more pronounced, and she realized that Rodriguez had sabotaged the fuel system. The aircraft was being deliberately starved of fuel, designed to fail at a time and place where rescue would be impossible. Jessica's training took over, her mind automatically calculating fuel consumption rates and flight time remaining. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the engines would begin to fail, and she was currently over the most remote part of the Nevada desert. Even if she could make a forced landing, the chances of survival in the desert were minimal. But Jessica Martinez was not going to die quietly. She pushed the aircraft into a steep climb, burning fuel at a faster rate, but gaining altitude that might give her more options when the engines failed. At the same time, she began broadcasting on the emergency frequency, hoping that someone would hear her final message. Mayday, Mayday, this is Captain Jessica Martinez in experimental aircraft XR-7. I am experiencing fuel system failure due to sabotage. Repeat, this aircraft has been sabotaged. Colonel Davidson, Lieutenant Thompson, and maintenance technician Rodriguez are involved in espionage activities. They have stolen classified materials and are attempting to murder me to cover their tracks. The response was immediate and unexpected. Captain Martinez, this is Captain Torres in F-16 call sign Viper 1. I am en route to your position. Continue broadcasting on this frequency and maintain your current heading. Jessica's heart leaped with relief. Torres had believed her, had somehow convinced his superiors to let him launch, and was coming to help. Viper 1, my fuel system has been sabotaged. I estimate engine failure in approximately 15 minutes. I am over coordinates. Jessica read off her position, hoping that Torres could reach her in time. The fuel flow was becoming more erratic, and she could hear subtle changes in the engine tone that indicated impending failure. Roger, Captain Martinez. I have you on radar and am closing on your position. Can you maintain altitude? Tor's voice was calm and professional, but Jessica could hear the urgency underneath. He was pushing his F-16 to its limits, trying to reach her before the sabotage claimed her life. Jessica looked at her instruments and made a decision that would have seemed insane under normal circumstances. Instead of conserving fuel and trying to extend her flight time, she pushed the engines to maximum power and began a series of aggressive maneuvers that would burn fuel even faster. If she was going to die, she was going to make sure everyone knew it wasn't an accident. The XR-7 responded beautifully to her inputs, climbing and diving with the precision of a fighter aircraft. Jessica flew patterns that would be impossible to mistake for system malfunction, spelling out letters in the sky that could be seen from orbit. Anyone reviewing the flight data would know that she had been in complete control of her aircraft until the very end. "Captain Martinez, I have visual contact with your aircraft," Torres announced. "I can see the burn patterns on your nose cone. They're consistent with radioactive exposure. You've been flying hot materials." Jessica's blood ran cold as she realized the full implications. She hadn't just been carrying stolen technology. She'd been exposed to deadly radiation for months. "Viper 1, I need you to document everything you're seeing," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the growing engine roughness. "Take photographs, record telemetry, get everything you can. This evidence has to survive even if I don't." Torres acknowledged, and Jessica could see the F-16 positioning itself for optimal documentation. The first engine failed at exactly the moment Jessica's calculations had predicted. The XR-7 shuddered and began to lose altitude, but Jessica maintained control, using her remaining engine to continue her aerial documentation. She was creating a record that would expose the conspiracy, even if it cost her life. With only one engine functioning, the XR-7 became a different aircraft entirely. Jessica had to constantly fight to maintain level flight, her hands working the controls with the precision of a concert pianist. The desert floor was getting closer, and she could see the scattered rocks and canyons that would make any landing attempt extremely dangerous. "Captain Martinez, I'm going to try something," Torres announced over the radio. "I'm going to position my aircraft underneath yours and try to provide additional lift. It's never been done before, but theoretically it should work." Jessica understood immediately. Torres was going to try to use the aerodynamic effects of his F-16 to help support her failing aircraft. "Negative, Viper 1, Jessica replied immediately. "That's too dangerous. If something goes wrong, we'll both be killed." But Torres was already moving into position, his F-16 sliding beneath the XR-7 with millimeter precision. Jessica felt her aircraft respond to the additional airflow, gaining just enough lift to maintain altitude. "Captain, I've got you," Torres said, his voice tight with concentration. "But I can't maintain this position for long. My fuel is running low, and this formation is extremely unstable. We need to find a landing site within the next 5 minutes." Jessica scanned the desert below, looking for any flat area that might be suitable for an emergency landing. The second engine failed just as Jessica spotted a dry lake bed about 3 miles ahead. The XR-7 immediately began to fall, but Torres adjusted his position, using his F-16's engine wash to provide crucial lift. It was an incredible display of flying skill, two aircraft dancing together in a formation that defied all conventional wisdom. "Lake bed at 2 o'clock, Jessica announced, banking toward the potential landing site. "I'm going to try to glide her in." Torres matched her turn, maintaining the delicate balance that was keeping her aircraft in the air. The ground was rushing up at them, and Jessica could see that they were going to be cutting it very close. At the last moment, Tors pulled away, unable to maintain the formation during the actual landing. Jessica was on her own for the final approach, gliding a dead aircraft toward a patch of desert that might or might not be solid enough to support her weight. The XR-7 hit the lake bed hard, bouncing twice before settling into a grinding slide that seemed to last forever. When the aircraft finally came to rest, Jessica was alive but shaken. She could see Tors circling overhead, waiting to see if she would emerge from the wreckage. Jessica quickly shut down all remaining systems, grabbed her survival kit, and climbed out of the cockpit. The aircraft was damaged but intact, and more importantly, the evidence of the sabotage was preserved. Viper 1, I'm alive and mobile, Jessica announced into her survival radio. The aircraft is intact, and I need you to maintain overwatch until recovery teams arrive. This site needs to be secured immediately. Tors acknowledged, and Jessica could see him settling into a protective orbit around the crash site. Jessica examined her aircraft more closely, now able to see the full extent of Rodriguez's sabotage. The fuel lines had been deliberately compromised,